Laura, welcome to both Derby Book Festival and Buxton International Festival. Now, this is a complete treat because you were booked to come to Derby and Buxton to talk about your book on the Mitfords, but this is just too wonderful a story to not speak to you about. So it's your lovely book, your latest book, The Last Landlady. And I think it's fair to say that it was a Guardian, Spectator and Mail on Sunday Book of the Year, and it has most glowing reviews, which I wholeheartedly endorse, as you will come to see, because I'm a complete gusher when it comes to this book. So
I love
it. Laura, tell us who Vi, the Last Landlady, is.
Oh God, she's I've got her picture here, but you won't be able to see her very well. But that's her as a girl of 15. She was terribly glamorous. She, my great grandfather, whom I never knew, was a publican, a London publican, and my grandmother, I think she viewed it as a vocation. Really, she sort of assumed the mantle of publican, and during the war, when he was getting on a bit, and she sort of ran the pub during the war. She always said it was the best time of her life. You can imagine this terribly good-looking woman with, you know, everyone coming into the pub and loving it. And then after her father died, so this pub that she'd been running, she was basically slung out because she was a woman. A wife could have taken it over, but not a daughter. So she had my mother. She was divorced, single mother, you know, with a young child. I mean, it doesn't really bear thinking about, but if you asked her about it, and she'd just say, oh, well, darling, it worked out, you know, we sorted it out, blah, blah. Anyway, eventually, she was given a pub of her own, but it was a country pub, and she was a very London girl. You know, she always wore, Estee Lauder was like her goddess, clothes from Beecham Place and all this sort of thing. And she always went to London one day a week to Wheelers she loved and everything. But she ran this country pub full of farmers and everything who are fantastic. And she turned it into, I mean, I spent a lot of my childhood there. Very weird childhood, dog racing, pubs. You know, my parents were pretty social, and I was at this pub, and I'd always wanted to write about it. And when I started writing about it, I could not believe how much I could remember. And it was a brilliant pub. You know, everyone sort of still says, you know, everybody went. It wasn't just the farmers, the town people, everything. But it was her, and I became very interested in this idea of what makes a good publican, which of course is very difficult for them to do now. You know, pub chains, pubs are in all sorts of trouble. I mean, the trouble they're in at the moment doesn't bear thinking about, but they were in trouble before. You had managers. You didn't really have such a thing as a landlord or a landlady. And I think they are what make a really great pub. And she was a very good landlady. So it's really about her and her style and her confidence, this female confidence that we've been talking about. Socially, she was not much to do with the Mitfords. In spirit, she was very Mitford. She had a blithe assurance that was nothing to do with arrogance. I say in the book, if you put her in Holloway Jail, if you put her at Buckingham Palace, she would have been the same. Sense of self was indestructible. And she, as a child, she fascinated me. She wasn't grandmotherly, you know, you had to step up to her mark, you know, if anything went wrong at school, she'd go, well, chin up, pub code, you know, put your face on and get on with it. And she did have an incredible style. So it's about her, but through her, you know, the pub and what it has meant, particularly, and I know other countries have pubs, but particularly to England, I think, because I think there's something about the English, I don't know whether, can you have national characteristics? I tend to think you can. And there's something about the English that does respond to the pub. And of course, it's going from our lives. It's really a social history through her. You know, I remember toward the end of her tenure at the pub, she was asked to do food, which she thought was like akin to, she really thought food was decadent in pubs. She'd put a lump of cheddar on the bar, the biggest lump of cheddar you ever saw, with a load of stuff, and people could have a bit of that. And that was pub food. But food, sandwiches, pies, she thought that was wrong. That was not pub. And it did change the atmosphere of the pub. And then she sort of drifted away from it and came to live in the house I'm in now. And all around me are her decanters and her brandy glasses and everything. I came to think of the pub as an expression of a certain philosophy of life, you know, acceptance of transgression, a rather forgiving. I talk quite a lot about Patrick Hamilton in the book, and how he, in one of my favorite novels, The Slaves of Solitude, he sets the boarding house mentality against the pub mentality. And, you know, one is repressed and correct and well behaved, and the other is, you know, transgressive and but kind of human. And I came to think that pubs were really rather important, actually. Writing her life, that was what I discovered, how much I loved pubs and how important I thought they were.
I mean, we're recording this during tricky times when people are desperate for things to read. So I would say that I had owned The Slaves of Solitude by Patrick Hamilton for a good decade. And having read your book, I read Patrick Hamilton, and I said to you how much I had enjoyed that book and that work. You wear your scholarship very lightly on the sort of social history of the pub that is intrinsic to the book. You don't realise how much you're picking up because you are mesmerised by these amazing characters. And thinking of the food, one of the other great characters, of which there's many, is Irene. And when it comes to food, it's Vi's friends that really push that on, don't they? In their crazy, very tiny pub kitchen.
Oh God, that kitchen. I mean, I dread to think, you know, now health and safety would be, I mean, you know, it really, and I mean, yes, we are going back sort of 30 plus years, but nevertheless, I don't know how they got away with it. But but the food, you see, she had you know, my father always used to say, because he adored her and he was a regular, you know, coming back, he worked in London, come back from London, stop off, drink with Violet. And it was like that thing, it was like a sort of sane stopping place in the day, you know. And that pub, I mean, all sorts of people went to that pub. Some of them were rather sort of well-to-do, some of them were poor old boys, you know, some of them were, like I said, the farmers, who were the life, really. God, brilliant. And but it was that, like horse racing used to be, but it isn't really anymore. You know, anyone could go, and there had to be, in a good pub, of course a bad pub is different, a spirit of acceptance, you know. I always remember in the mornings, which was so boring, and because I used to serve behind the bar when I was doing my A-levels, and I thought that would be quite exciting. It was so boring. And there were these three who used to sit on a settle, which had come from my grandfather's pub, beautiful settle. And they never hardly spoke. One had been a prisoner of war, and I mean, he never got over it. And this poor woman who used to sit there and try and make conversation with these old boys. I don't know what they were doing there, but it was better. It was like you realize the value of the words public house. You're at home, but you're not quite at home. So you've got to put on a little bit, even there's a little bit of a show you're putting on. You're just making a little bit of an effort, but you're at home and you can still be yourself and people will accept you. Of course, a bad pub's completely different. You know, that's terrible. A bad pub there's nothing worse. But I did find myself thinking a lot about those three and how every day, instead of, I say, sitting at home, they could have sat at home and watched Crown Court, but they didn't. They made the effort and went to the pub. Obviously, they wanted to drink, obviously, but there was something a little bit more than that going on. And there's something, there's, you know, there's something, and I talk quite a lot about the difference between drink and pubs, and how I know people say nowadays that everyone's drinking less. There must be people that I don't know or don't see, because it seems to me that people are drinking a lot more. And drink and pubs are they're slightly different concepts, you know, and that drink for the sake of being drunk is not really. In a pub, you try to hold your end up, you try to hide the fact that you were raging drunk, because there is this kind of pub code which the landlord or landlady kind of was orchestrating and expecting you to behave to a certain standard, which you probably would not do, but nevertheless you strove to play your part in the evening. And of course also you had opening hours, closing hours, and that made a hell of a difference. This regulated pleasure, which is not what pubs are like now. They're just, it's all pleasure, so therefore it becomes a bit pleasureless.
Tell us a little bit about Victor, because it's important for my next question is to kind of get this picture of the key protagonists in this.
Oh yeah, well, Victor, that's not his real name. I always get a bit giggly when I think about him, because he was quite a smart sort of man. She'd met him during the war, and he was married, but anyway, then they both were divorced, but they never got married again. She didn't want to. She didn't really want anyone. She was married to the pub. And as I say, she thought of it almost like a vocation, because she had brothers, but she was the one who took it on. And she really was, it was like a vocation. It suited her personality. She had a huge amount of personality, and that was the way she expressed it. And everybody lapped it up, and she never made herself cheap, but they all wanted to be in with her. So Victor was a kind of adjunct. She had to have something. She always used to say, "You've got to have a man," which is, the way people talked. It's exactly what Debo Devonshire said to me. And she did rely on my father a certain amount to do like her taxes and everything. But Victor had been a guitarist, and he played with Louis Armstrong when Louis Armstrong did a British tour. I can't quite remember when. And anyway, he played with him, which gave him a certain glamour. And he could, when they went on their days to London once a week, he was known. He could go, and they sort of saw everyone. They went to see Danny Kaye, and they were you couldn't, it was standing room only. They were standing at the back with Vera Lynn, and what was her husband's name? Harry something. They knew all those people, and he could go to Denmark Street, and all the musicians knew him. He had a certain glamour, and he would take her to the Colony Club and things like that. So there was this kind of, and the Caprice where Princess Margaret always was and everything. So she kind of touched on that semi-bohemian 50s glamour that I also found quite fascinating to write about. Because now everything is so in your face and imagistic, and what really fascinated me about her was that she just lived her life. She had no introspection. When I asked her a question, she was bloody hopeless at answering it. And because she didn't reflect, I don't think being introspective would make you a good landlord, really. You've got to push your personality outwards. Very tiring twice a day, like being on the stage. And she lived this life that I thought was rather fascinating, these 50s play, the talk of the town, all that kind of thing. And Victor, I remember him as a kid because he always wanted to take me to the ballet because his brother had danced with Lou Grade or something. But, as a kid, you're too silly to go along with these things. And I should have gone and it would have been brilliant, but I was too sort of wrapped up in myself. But he had a kind of glamour, but he was an adjunct. And in the end, he just suddenly married somebody else. And I know people thought she was very upset about it. I don't think she was at all, really. But it was an interesting relationship. Her closer relationship really was with Irene. That's also not her real name. who was a bit of a cow, really. And she'd never forgiven Violet because her husband had been madly in love with Violet during the war and what have you. And all those undercurrents. And of course, the bit in the book that it did make me laugh out loud when I was writing it. Because as a kid, I'd sit in the little sitting room. She always had 2 chihuahuas, and I'd sit there, always a bowl of Quality Street. The chihuahuas, always Harper's and Queen. And in the kitchen, you could hear these 2 women making coffee, making whatever, talking in the most appalling way, really, about all the customers. But it was always very elliptical. So as a kid, I didn't really understand, you know, she'd say something like, well, he's gone off with old, so, oh, well, she's a old tart and all this kind of thing. It was always elliptical, and then they'd sort of murmur, it would die off. I remember them telling a story about how they'd been shown, my grandmother had been shown pictures, this woman had just gone on honeymoon with this old boy, and he'd come back and shown her, the wife had shown her all the pictures of him in the nude. I mean, the customers sort of, you know, but it was how they talked about it. It was so funny, and you're sort of absorbing the sound of adulthood, really, I suppose. And also that sense of backstage. Once you went in that little sitting room, you were off stage, and then the minute that opened, the pub, and they just, yeah, I suppose it was like actors in a dressing room or something, but it was the sound of adulthood to me. And then, of course, as I got older and started putting names to faces and all that, oh God, that's the one who did that, that's the one who did that. And inevitably, some of the glamour sort of died away once you get to know things, but also pubs were starting to change. But as a kid, it was the apotheosis of light and magic to me. Christmas there, I've never had Christmases like it since, you know. And the bar, that glass on glass of the bar. Yeah, I probably imagine it too beautifully, but it's, you know, those pictures are in my mind.
There's a lovely quote from the which is on the back of the paperback, which likens the book to a Terence Davies film. And I have to say, I read that, and I'm a huge fan of his. And I thought, gosh, well, if it's anything like, you know, that would be nice if it kind of was, which the book absolutely is. And the book, I mean, if anyone's watching and can make this into a TV series, I think this is very important that this gets done. I mean, the people that made A Very British Scandal about the Jeremy Thorpe incident, they would have a field day with this. The characters are wonderful, the setting is wonderful, that sense of an England lost is absolutely there with spades. And also in Vi, you have this amazing role for an older actress.
Mm-hmm.
And with that in mind, is there somebody that could play Vi?
She would, oh my goodness, Vicky, if she could hear you. She didn't die that long ago. I tell you what, whiskey every night and fried breakfast can get you to 96. I probably shouldn't say that, but she was 96. Yes, I mean, she's a gift of a role for, I can't think of anyone at the moment, really. But I mean, we've got the most amazing older actresses in this country, haven't we? I mean, just amazing. It is a gift of a role. She's so firm in my mind. I can't imagine anyone doing it somehow. But yeah, I love what you're saying. I mean, I think it would look amazing on screen.
I mean, I think Helena Bonham Carter can actually.
Oh God, yeah.
Pretty. She's actually quite good at playing across kind of class boundaries. I've seen her in things where she's been a resolutely working class sort of grande dame, and I think that she could do something like that. But also Vi had a penchant for Harrods, didn't she? So I mean, that's such fun.
Oh God, Helena Bonham Carter is I love Helena Bonham Carter. That's pretty inspired, actually. Yeah, she loved Harrods, but she did always used to say, oh, but a swank, all that kind of thing. Well, of course, there used to be a pub at Harrods. I remember going there when I was a kid. You went down in the basement, and there was the Green Man pub, and she could have a schooner of sherry with all her green and gold bags around her. She had style, Violet. She had style. She had a lot of personality, and she was like I said about the Mitfords, she was a good. I hate role model as a phrase, but she's someone I have in my head, and when I feel a bit sorry for myself or something like that, she's there. You know, she's there for me.
Which leads me perfectly on to my final question, which is really, without prying, Laura, you're a character in this book. You're narrator, you are granddaughter, you're barmaid, you go to ballet school, you go to Oxford. Obviously, your parents do feature in the book, but has Vi made you? Has Vi made you the author that starts with a book about dog racing and goes into Newmarket and just tackles those subjects so fearlessly?
A bit. My father as well. I mean, he was like a gambler, and the dog racing, which I now disapprove of so much, it's not true, but you know, that was my childhood as well. And horse racing. I lived in Newmarket because when Dad died, he left me a horse. You know, they were both, it's funny, they were both ultra respectful, but a little bit bohemian, whatever. But I don't think of it like that. I just think of it as England, really. And I don't mean that in any, I don't know, it's such a loaded word these days, isn't it? They both symbolize a kind of rather racy past that I don't think we have anymore. I always think of my grandmother's, her patron saint was Max Miller, really, that kind of, you know, a little bit louche, a little bit, but sane, beautifully sane. So I think her and Dad gave me an upbringing that was a bit unusual, because yes, in the middle of it all, I'd go off to ballet school. And my adorable mum, who's behind the door here, you know, who was the black sheep because she hates alcohol, and she was kind of like the rock, the anchor. But I've written about Violet and my father because they both represent worlds that we don't really have anymore, I suppose. I feel very blessed, really, to have had that childhood. Unusual, but and very secure, you know, I've got to be honest. And but imaginatively very stimulating. A bit like a Mitford childhood, but quite different.
Laura, it's been a complete pleasure to speak to you, and I do absolutely look forward to whatever else you choose to write about. I'm sure it will be a hoot.
Vicky,
thank you very much.
What can I say? You are wonderful. I've loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you.